One of the biggest challenges for newcomers to Flight Simulator is how to go about learning how to fly a new airplane. Flight Sim comes with very little instructions on how to fly any of the planes in it other than the one in the initial tutorial, and even that I feel is lacking a lot of information. Today I'm going to share with you my 3-step process that I use to learn any plane in the game. It'll make the experience of playing with the game a lot more fun and realistic. I start by finding all the information I need by doing a little bit of Googling and a little bit of note taking so that once I actually get into the cockpit, I have an idea of what to expect from the plane. The second step is where I jump into the cockpit, familiarize myself with a lot of the controls and the instruments in the plane that I'm flying, and finally I'll do a takeoff, do a couple maneuvers up in the air, and then come back down for landing. Alright, so let's take a look at those steps in a little bit more detail. Before I even step foot in the game, the first thing I like to do is collect a little bit of basic information about the plane that I'm trying to learn to fly. So as you can see, what I'm looking for is how to configure the plane for takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, and final. This is the absolute minimum information you're going to want for trying to fly a new plane. I really wish Microsoft would include this information as part of the game, whether it's through a checklist or something else, but they don't, so unfortunately we have to do it ourselves. For each of those phases of flight, I want the airspeed approximately I should be flying, what the power settings should be, what the flaps should be, and any additional notes that I want to take that might be relevant to know about. These settings will differ based on the flying conditions you're using, but for a first flight, which you usually do in relatively decent conditions, it'll be sufficient. So to collect that information, I'm just going to switch over to my browser and start doing a few searches. To find the information I'm looking for, I'll usually start by searching for the name of the airplane that I'm looking for, which in this case is the Beechcraft Bonanza G36. And then there's a few keywords you can add to find some useful results. The first of those keywords that I'll look for is usually airspeeds. That might come up with a table that'll have all the airspeeds listed for you, which is kind of neat. You can just copy those over. Sometimes you won't be able to find anything quite like that though. In those cases, what I'll do is I'll do a follow-up search for the name of the aircraft, and then I'll add something like checklist or flight profiles, and those will usually come up with some decent results as well. As a last resort, if I wasn't able to find the information available somewhere on the web, what you can search for is the pilot's operating handbook of the plane. So this will come up with results for the real operating handbook for the real airplane, but you can totally use this information for flying the plane in the game. I usually keep the pilot's operating handbook as a last resort because it is really verbose when you get into it. There's a lot of extra detail you don't actually need, and it can take a lot of time to filter through and find what you're actually looking for. But if you've got no other options and it's the only place, you'll definitely find everything you need to fill out that table within that document. So now what I've got is a nice and filled out table which tells me what airspeed to fly at for a given configuration, what power settings should give me that airspeed, and the flaps configuration and any additional information that I wanted to know about. So with all this in a single place, it's really easy for me when I'm trying to fly the plane to just reference back to it. I can either print it off or just have it on a second screen, and I can use it whenever I need it in-game. So that's step one. For step two, it's time to jump into the cockpit. So step two, as I was hinting at, is all about familiarizing yourself with the plane in the game before you actually take off. I usually recommend choosing fairly ideal conditions for that first flight with a new airplane. Something like the clear skies or few clouds or scattered clouds presets will do nicely. So there's a few instruments that I like to make sure that I know where they are and how to operate them. The first of those instruments is the attitude indicator, which in the case of the Bonanza is integrated to the G1000 in the plane, and you can see it right here. The second thing is I like to make sure I know where my airspeed is. Usually all the planes with the G1000 are fairly similar, so as you guessed, on the left here we've got our airspeed indicator, and on the right we've got our altitude indicator. And finally we also have our heading indicator right below it here. Then the next thing I like to do is I want to make sure that I understand where and how to affect all the control surfaces in this plane. It's the first time I'm flying this plane, but I suspect there's probably a throttle quadrant hidden around here somewhere. Yep, and there it is. So I can see here that this plane has a throttle, it has a propeller control, and it has a mixture control. So obviously I could control the prop and the mixture with the mouse right here, but that's not ideal when you're in the middle of a flight to switch down to this view and not have any idea what's happening outside of the cockpit. So what I always do is I make sure that I know what key bindings are mapped to the propeller and the mixture control, and I'll also map it to keys on my joystick if it's something that I think I'll be using fairly frequently. So in this case, what I've done is I've mapped the propeller control to 2 buttons on my joystick so that I can adjust it without having to look down. I can also see this plane has a retractable landing gear and the control is here. I don't usually map the landing gear control because I know that on the keyboard you just press the G button and it will bring the landing gear up or down, so I don't worry about that one too much. Flaps controls are here as well. Again, I make sure to map those to my joystick so that I don't have to fiddle with the keyboard when I'm flying. And finally, we do have the elevator trim right here, which I also map to keys on my joystick. The other one that's kind of important as well is the parking brake right here, which without it you won't be able to get moving. You don't really need to map this one either. This is one you can probably just control with the mouse if you like, because it's not like you're going to be using it very frequently. Finally, you can also see the rudder pedals there, which on my joystick is mapped to the twist motion of the joystick. All the other controls, from the lights to everything on the GPS, you don't really need to know for your first introductory flight to the plane. You really just want to be able to focus on flying in this first flight. And that's it for step 2. Step 3, as you've probably guessed, is getting up in the air and actually flying the plane. I won't take you through the whole flight because it'll be a little bit repetitive from my previous videos, but the things that I do want you to try on your first introductory flight is obviously taking off, doing a climb up to a decent cruise altitude, say around 5,000 feet, perform a few steep turns left and right, do a couple of ascents and descents, practice entering slow flight and exiting slow flight, and finally turn around and come back and do an approach and landing. Once you've come back around and landed, what I usually do is I'll taxi back to another shorter runway, either at the same airport or at a different airport, and practice my short and soft field landings. I've done previous videos on most of those topics before, so I will add a few links to this video for you to be able to find them easily. Obviously, that's just going to scratch the surface of familiarizing yourself with a plane, but it will give you a pretty good idea if you like the plane, if it's something you want to continue to learn about, or if you just want to switch to another plane entirely. I'll probably do some follow-up videos on the table that we created in the first step. There's a lot more information we could add to it that would be really useful if you decide to go further with a given plane, so look for that in the coming weeks. Until then, if you have any questions, make sure to put them in the comments section below. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.